Hello, and thank you for plugging in, as it were. Um, it's great to have you all, and I'm hearing there's lots of people. My name is Jeremy Purseglove, and I am a landscape architect and ecologist. Um, I've spent my life working mainly by accident, really, with civil engineers. Um, and so in that respect, I've been involved with lots of big projects. And I really, really worked in a way on the barbed wire between nature conservation and development, in that I'm the broker who's trying to make things happen without the result being absolutely wrecking the place. So that's my position and what my experience is. So we'll go to the subject matter, therefore, unsurprisingly, is landscape engineering and land use and how that relates to climate change. Here we are on a beautiful day in the Caribbean. What could be more peaceful? But lo and behold, horror and disaster. I went out in 1999 to do the damage assessment for a hurricane that hit the Bahamas. And I was horrified to discover what I saw. I mean, one knows about climate change, but the first-hand view of it was shocking. I met people who had held their children up in the air as the waves met under their chins in their own houses. I saw houses like this completely wrecked. The thing was the scale of the damage. Hurricanes have always happened, but they have got worse with climate change. It was absolutely shocking. So that was a terrible thing to see. And indeed, I worked with some of the communities, and 10 years later, the government had still not moved their housing out from the most vulnerable places below sea level, so they were hit again. One of the things that is always true to the results of climate change is the poor are the ones who will get worst affected on the whole. So terrible business and a wake-up call. Returning to England, here we are, and it's something we know all about. Even just this last week, my local rivers of the Nin and the Welland in Northants, Rutland, have been flooding their fields all around them, and we all know how bad the flooding has been. So this takes me to how I started my journey as an environmentalist working with civil engineers. In 1977, I joined the Severn Trent Water Authority, the first ecologist environmentalist in the newly formed water industry. And this is a strange picture, but I will explain it. I was called out by a river engineer. I'd never heard of river engineers. And he said, we've got this problem. I'm trying to stop the floods. And I've got a particular problem. I've got a woman tied to a tree. There's a willow tree at the bottom of her garden, and it's leaning out into the river, like you see this willow here, on the top left of the painting. And it's got to come out because it'll block the river. Would you just come out and talk nicely to her and get herself to untie herself, or let me untie her, and then we can chop it down and get on with the job. So that was my first experience of the conflict between nature conservation and river engineering, which took over my life for the rest of my life. You look at this picture, which is Millet's painting of Ophelia. They were very accurate, the pre-Raphaelites, so it's almost better than any photograph. It shows you all the things that caused the problem. So the willow is leaning into the brook. It will soon fall in and block it. The dog roses on the right-hand side with the white flowers hang over the brook, and they will soon block it and catch any dead dogs and supermarket trolleys that are coming down with the flood. The water weeds in the foreground all help to block it, and the sliding bank on the right with the teasel is slipping in. So there's only one thing to do as far as the river engineer is concerned. Try and forget the lady. She might be the Wildlife Trust lady with her bouquet, having had an argument with the landowner and the river engineer, and this is what they would do to the river. So dealing with all those habitats that we see as rather lovely is the real bare solution is to do this. And this was happening to rivers all over England, and it still does to a degree. There was a big row about one recently in the West Country, but that is the kind of extreme position. Out it came. And of course, that ignored the fact that the lady who was tied to the tree had a different set of values. She wanted a beautiful river. Rivers are not just so many volumes of water being carried away, though they don't flood you. They're also something to do with the wind in the willows and having nice picnics and dragonflies and all those things. The lesson in this was we learned, I learned with the engineers and the digger drivers, that there was a way of dealing with it. And what we did is we lowered the levels of the rivers and then were able to do things that were thoughtful to put lots of habitats back. So here is the machine, which previously was doing that to a river, is transplanting water forget-me-not and branch burr reed to put into a new margin on the edge of the river. And they would pull out ponds that were previously filled with the silt from the dredgings. I would always have to talk to the farmers who owned the land, and if you chatted them up nicely, there was a value there. They were interested in things like saving some of the trees, and there was a whole middle way of doing this thing. And that became news because it didn't mean you had to give up and do nothing about the floods. And it was, as I say, the path to the rest of my life. And what it really tells you, and this is the first big sort of killer point of this talk, is you can do things well or badly or well. And that is something that we learned. And very soon we were putting the bends back in straightened rivers. This is an early German example. A river straightened out by Hitler, actually. I always like to think of the river engineers being allied to the worst possible people. Not always the case. But here we have the bends being put up and the straight channel stacked up. And so we've been expanding wetlands in this way. Wickham Fen up the road from you now, where we've been buying large areas of farmland and flooding them for wildlife, which many of you may know. So that's so much for the engineering. That's the engineering story. Most of this talk is going to be about land use and farming. And so the landscape, the gorgeous, diverse landscape of England. This is actually near the Malverns, and you've got all that texture of traditional fields and hedges and woods and so on. And it's still a working landscape. It's still earning its keep, not a wilderness. And so that was why farmers often were said to be, which they often were, guardians of the landscape. However, this is what was happening and still happens. So we have this, the next story, well or badly. Well or badly. I get accused sometimes of being harsh about farmers, and I'm always trying to point out there's lots of good things, good ways of farming, and very bad ways of farming. Driven by technology and money, you'll be familiar with this landscape. This is the kind of thing you see as you go walking out from Cambridge. It's our traditional agribusiness. Those little trees in the middle of those that enormous field, weren't planted by the farmer. He wouldn't want to plough around it. They're the last shreds of the hedgerows that have been ripped up. And this happened for my lifetime, since I was working steadily. And we inherit it. And my children don't realize that England shouldn't look like this. They've only seen most of England looking like this, so they just think that's what it should look like. And not only is it hideous and dead, because there's not a bird. If you had a housing estate on that, it would be more interesting. You'd have lots of nesting birds. There is nothing that lives on that landscape. No insects, no birds, no life, and also no people. And the thing that happened to this intensification of agriculture in UK was that the small farmer became as rare as the curlew or the avocet, because this became the domain of intensive, large landowners, about 10 to 15 per county as cooperatives, and the little farmer vanished. So that was another casualty. It wasn't just the wildlife. And so what happens is that you have the machinery, and it's going to very severely affect the soil, because with particularly the ploughing, this man's harvesting, but the machines that plough it will mess up the topsoil. It means that the water flows off the surface. It doesn't enter the ground because it's not porous any longer. Down it goes, carrying away the mud, and off it goes down the stream. And it carries away down in a canalized river with a bank on either side, as they were designed really to do in the bad old days, to help farmers, which were seen as the main beneficiaries, and until it hits the nearest town. Things are starting to change now. There's another story to tell you about that. That is your traditional way in which the water left the land. However, we're back to things done well and badly. In this case, this is a cereal field. This is not just your very mixed farm. This is a deliberate cereal field done in Leicestershire by the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. It's well worth visiting. There's another farm like this at Knapwell, run by the RSPB, called Hope Farm. And these are cereal farms that set out to be very profitable, make a living entirely like all other cereal farms, and yet there's a margin around the edge of the field, there's lots of trees, there are beetle banks that mean that the insects eat the more destructive other insects, and the whole thing is balanced. So much for the UK. Then you have the situation in the tropics, which I've worked at a lot. And we all know about the rainforests and how they have been terribly damaged in modern times. And Indonesia in particular has been set fire to. I've been working a lot over there on a yearly basis, and the destruction is terrible, and it's made worse by the palm oil, which is the most notorious of crops, perhaps. And that is another monoculture like the cereals in Cambridgeshire. That is well known, fairly lifeless, enormous. And so it's worsened by the fact that to create it in the first place, the forest has to be cleared, and loggers go in, and the fires are set light to, and it's very often an untransparent relationship between those who want to develop it for palm oil to the people who are doing the initial clearance, and the fires are not accidental, they're deliberate. So you have this terrible thing going on. However, I'm afraid this is an embarrassing picture of me, but basically you need to get your environmentalist in early. And so there are good ways and bad ways of even doing palm oil. So we get in early, and we would look at the map before they started their plantations. Plantations can be as big as Rutland, as a small English county, or larger. So if you put 20%, which I map out all along the river systems linked together, that are not to be planted, then you've got a very, very sizable habitat network and nature reserve within the protected girdle of the palm oil estate. And then the other things you can do, you make sure that the mill, which does pulls the oil out of the palm fruit, doesn't pollute the river, and then you look after your people who work there, and so you look after the people side of it. Then you've got a package of how to do it properly. So that's a monoculture modified. This is a more subtle thing, which is the agroforestry. So if you go to, I worked in Trinidad on cocoa, accidentally, because I was building roads. And if you go into the cocoa plantations there, cocoa is a smallish tree, the size of a hazel you might get in an English wood, and it needs the shade. So you can see that the trunk of the cocoa has got marvelous mosses growing up. There'll be orchids growing on the branches. You get fabulous birds like trogons nesting in the cocoa. But the marvelous thing is it polices itself, because the cocoa farmer who makes his living for the chocolate industry will defend the forest against people who come and try and burn it to keep his cocoa going. So that's a magic thing. And it's not easy to find a good example of agroforestry in the UK, but a traditional orchard would be one, whereby you have wildflowers and sometimes daffodils underneath, sheep grazing, which is traditionally part of the profit, and then the fruit trees. So you've got a network, and the birds nest in the apple trees. It's not like a field of wheat. You'll have woodpeckers and bullfinches and things like that. The other thing about this story is it's had a renaissance. Most fruit farms were destroyed for the ubiquitous cereal crops in England. Indeed, in Kent in 1950, there were 3,000 commercial cherry orchards just in one county. By 50 years later, 2020, the whole of England and Wales had only about 160 commercial cherry orchards left, all pushed out for wheat. But the thing about this is you never know. What happened in 2007, Magners, an Irish firm, suddenly buttoned onto cider. And it was, if we remember in the past, it was a plastic bottle. It was made from apple concentrate from China. It was not an exciting drink. You used to put it in the boiling bacon, and it was a favorite of students who were very hard up. Suddenly, cider was chic, and they put it in bottles, and elegant people were drinking it in the smart places in London. And suddenly, small operatives were successfully bringing in cider orchards. So all this well and badly stuff, but one of the ways through is clearly certification. So what you can do is you, the consumer, can find out whether you're getting things that are done well or badly and go for that. And FSC was the most famous one, the Forest Stewardship Council. And you can actually, believe it or not, sustainably harvest hardwoods from rainforests. If you do it carefully, you know what you're doing. So they've been marvelous and they were trailblazing, but there's been the MSC, which is the Marine Stewardship Council for fish. There's been RSPO, which is the round table for palm oil. And so all these things, and there's one for cereals. So all these things can be done. I have to warn you that it isn't an instant fix. The famous mantra I say about certification is what does it mean and how do you know? When you look at the small print, it's often difficult, but start with it. Try to look for certified goods. The more we use them, the better the system you get, but it isn't always perfect. Some more lovely ways of growing things. This is Bangladesh, and it's marvelous place, I thought, in the Delta. So they're growing the rice, but they also put the fish in the rice paddy, and the fish poo feeds the rice, and the oxygen is improved, and the whole thing is a marvelous symbiotic system. And then they're growing marrows and cucumbers over on bamboo trellises over the water, and that also is a marvelously neat way. It's a garden. It's a huge woven garden of bamboo and rice. They have a bird there, the drongo, which sits on the poles there, and it catches all the insects. So you only got to put a pole in, the drongo will arrive, and it's a kind of way of devouring a lot of the damaging insects. It's not going to be perfect, but it's a lot better than covering the whole place in chemicals, which actually then has other adverse effects. So you have this marvelous rice and bamboo landscape. And there they have the little boy in the front with his fabulous fish trap, the rectangular fish trap, all made of little strips of bamboo. And then the buildings are made of bamboo poles, and then with rice thatch. And the whole thing it's lovely. And that is one of the many. I couldn't give you anything like the infinite number of examples to be found in the world of this thoughtful way of growing things rather than a monoculture. And that takes us to Africa, where I was born. And these are shea nut trees, which are really very interesting things. It's a native wild tree, and it grows. This is it growing wild. This is never planted. This is actually the shea nut savanna, and it is a girdle from West Africa right across in the sub-Saharan section, right across to sort of Ethiopia, all the way across Africa, where the climate is right for these savannas. And they're fabulous. And the nuts which are gathered from them are very commercial. They go into cosmetics. You must have had shea butter. And this thing is brilliant. And we were working there, and I was very, very keen that nobody was trying to undermine that. And again, the chiefs were saying, this is their livelihood, and they would be very cross if anyone tried to intensify that or chop the trees down. And it's jolly handy in form of income. And that system has masses of cattle, and they migrate from further north in the nearer to the Sahara at certain times of year and come down and use that area. There are lots of other different kinds of trees which are native there, which are marvelous, and fabulous birds, turrico and so on. So you've got a natural system which is just being harvested, and they have little onion beds and gardens underneath. So it's super. All over Africa, there is a sort of, that is a very brilliant example, but in a looser way, you have what in East Africa is called a shamba, which is Swahili for market garden, and it's what the people live off. And they're little tiny systems of cultivation, but they keep everybody going, and they're brilliant, and they're full of diversity. You'll find gloriosa coming up in a shamba the way you might find bindweed coming up in your allotment. And the birds are good, and there's plenty of productivity. And the landscape itself is understood and respected and worshipped, constantly finding this is a sacred tree, and there are sacred stones. Africa really is a kind of Stonehenge, but the Druids are still there, because this landscape is more than just beautiful place. It's a spiritual place, very deeply into the African psyche. So what is happening there? I'm afraid this all over again, the great African land grab. And this is happening all over Africa. It's slowed down a bit. I've referenced it all in my book, so you can work out more detail. But basically, this is removing that and turning it into monoculture. And who's doing it? Well, the first piece, if I ask somebody who's done it, mostly people say, oh, it must be the Chinese. No, it isn't the Chinese. They're doing other things in Africa that aren't brilliant. But it's America, and worse still, Europe, and worst of all, Britain. And large agribusiness farmers from Yorkshire and such places are buying up farmland, which is terribly cheap in Africa, and turning into cereals or sugarcane, or most shockingly of all, biomass crops, which are the devil as far as I'm concerned, because they're another monoculture, but they're invoked as a wonderful way of helping out with climate change. And so that is a terrible thing. And one of the most shocking things I've seen in my travels. So here we go. Remember him. Oh dear, he seems a long time ago now, doesn't he, Mr. Cameron? And you can see he's standing there in the Somerset Levels flood, and his poster is reflected in the water. We feel your pain, vote Tory. And he, of course, started all the Brexit thing, which we are now seeing the final solution of. What I want to say about that is, cheer up. It's not as bad this entirely as you might think. There is a silver lining on the land use front, because the situation there is that we now finally have got rid of the common agricultural policy. And I voted to remain in Europe, but I've spent my life fighting the CAP, as it's known, and that has been never reformed within Europe. It remains as a problem in Europe for the landscapes. And that was payments. It's enormous sums of money. In Britain, 3 billion a year to the farmers, 55% of their income. And it was so not nuanced that it was just, all you did is you filled out your area of land. So if you had 5 acres or 1 million acres, and then you got per acre the payment. So that drove the intensification of agriculture that we've seen destroy the English landscape. And now that is gone, I can't tell you what a sigh of relief we all feel. And Tony Juniper will be telling you, similarly, we're all very pleased about that departing. And now we do have some more sensible rules here that are coming in. We don't know the detail yet, we have to wait and see. But since the Queen's speech in December 2019, finer details are emerging. There's a very promising thing called ELMS, which is Environmental Land Management Schemes. And the concept is clear. There probably won't be as much dished out as there was in the past to agriculture, but I mean, I don't think that matters terribly. The truth is that that then, if the taxpayer is paying for it, then the taxpayer needs to get the benefit from it. So all the payments will be for farmers to do things that are sensible with the land, setting land aside and all that kind of stuff. There were good green deals under Europe, of course, but they were, in terms of the land use of farmland, totally negated and undermined by this big CAP. So the departure of that is great news. And so that is one good thing that's happened. And now this is one, which is probably one of my last slides. And this probably will fill you all with shock and horror. This is laboratory grown food. And I think it is very exciting and promising. It is just, the technology is just coming in. There are two major planks of it. Don't ask me the fine details, I'm not a biochemist. But basically, you can do cell division, you can take a piece of meat, and it will divide in a bioreactor and go on dividing and dividing. That's quite expensive, but that is the basis of a thing called the Impossible Burger, which was launched in a New York restaurant in 2016, and is now all across America. Or you can do, which is probably more realistic, various forms of yeast, biologically, manipulated in again, a vast tank. So suddenly you have food for the first time ever not being produced by farming. In that, I mean, there obviously have been kinds of farming, like if you, I don't know, I won't go into that, but it's a complete change. And that means that you don't any longer have to have square miles, hundreds of square miles in the UK and elsewhere under agribusiness, because you can grow some of your staples in a thing that looks like a brewery on the edge of a city. So that's an instant win in terms of land use. Of course, there are going to be lots of problems and lots of things that might go wrong. And there are questions. First thing is, people say, I couldn't possibly eat that, revolting. But actually, I know a vegan who didn't like the Impossible Burger because it tasted so like meat. And actually, that is one way of dealing with it. But you can also grow the protein that you feed the cattle on. They won't complain. And then you cut out all that enormous cereal. So there are things that you can do in that respect, which are very exciting. There's another problem with energy, which is you're doing without photosynthesis. It's the first time you've not used photosynthesis in producing protein like that. So you've got to put the energy in. So you would have to have lots of solar and wind, but that's all winning now. More than 50% in renewables for energy in the UK. And indeed, this approach, which I'm sure will have its problems, is a very interesting and exciting revolution in farm producing. It also means that the farming lobby can no longer go on saying, you can't do without us, we'll plough every hedge forever because you're going to run out of food, because there are other ways of doing it. So it is almost the equivalent for the way in which the old oil men have had to give up saying, you can't do without us, because actually the solar panels and the wind have started to do it as well. So that's a very exciting, interesting, but not without challenges and problems, I'm sure, way of dealing with this. So this is my last picture. And I'm just about right, given that we missed a bit at the beginning. And that's the thing about nature is that it's its own best advocate. And it's marvelous the way I've taken people from lottery to get money for a project, or planning committees out on site, and they come back through the mud and the rain looking determined, having seen this gorgeous place close up. Oh, what a lovely place. They want to save it. And I remember going down on my river days, talking to a farmer, and there was a meander. I said, oh, don't fill the meander in, you could do it a little bit less now. Oh, go on. And he said, I don't know. And then the kingfisher flew down the channel, and there it was. And the farmer turned to me and he said, okay, you win. And that kingfisher, that bird sealed our bargain. So this is the book that I bought out this last couple of years, paperback this last spring. And if anyone's interested, easy to Google. Thank you very much.